President Sunday responded to my video. I watched it, then I took a break from my shitty job to drink a little bit of French wine, no, I'm lying, a lot of French wine, and eventually make the video I should have made the first time round. We're gonna do some jumping back and forth in this video, responding to clips from Sunday's response and clarifying some points, but I'll do my best to keep things as easy to follow as possible. I'll also be flashing up timestamps for the claims I make, so just know that when a timestamp appears, it relates to President Sunday's response video unless I specify otherwise. For those of you clicking on this without context, this is a response to President Sunday's response to my first video. While it helps to watch those videos, it isn't necessary, because this should still be easy to follow if you are abreast of the Vaush-Professor Flowers controversy in general. This is all super online shit, so if you're not into that scene, feel free to go back to watching some sweet Ibiza deep house chill tunes, or whatever it is people do on YouTube who don't spend all day watching Big Joel videos. The goal here is to expand on some points made in the original video and correct some others. Without further ado, let us begin. We'll start with something light.
This isn't to do with Professor Flowers. This is the tactical misogyny stuff that was the breakup between Vaush and ContraPoints. I don't know why this is here.
The reason I added stuff that was not directly related to Professor Flowers or you was because this is a comedic segment making fun of the debate bros in general. I thought that was obvious given that I conclude my sentence by saying in the debate bro community, and then Ride of the Valkyries is blaring, and the screen grabs are scrolling by too quickly for you to read them. But whatever, at least some of your audience seems to get it. I'll be sure to clearly mark my comedic segments from now on. An indigenous
Sisyphic tasks aren't doomed to failure, they have to be repeated. That's what that means. Sisyphus had to roll the thing up the hill endlessly. He didn't fail to roll it up the hill.
Okay, so this is not a big deal, but I do want to note that if you are going to be this pedantic about the myth of Sisyphus, it is not incorrect to say that Sisyphus's task is doomed to failure since he never succeeds. He pushes the boulder up the hill only for it to roll back as soon as he gets near the top, and he is stuck doing that futile task forever. Ergo, he will try for all eternity to get the boulder up the hill, but he is doomed to fail. Forever. Again, this doesn't really matter, but I couldn't resist addressing that. Her arguments about colonialism, about giving colonized people the rights to decide their own destinies, or about the...
No. The discussion moved towards whether or not you could have an actual political situation in which Black people are quote-unquote able to live apart from their oppressors, and then practically what does that look like? And when the problems associated with trying to remove oppressor groups from a state were brought up, she tried to argue that actually you can do so in a non-genocidal fashion. Now, according to the UN's definition of genocide, that's physically impossible, but that's overly broad. Let's just bring it right down to, like, are you actually killing people or destroying cultures or whatever? She contended, I maintain naively, that you could remove entire groups of people categorically on effectively racial grounds, because those are the only grounds that were put forward in the context of that conversation. That you could do so bloodlessly. And conceptually you can. Practically that's a different question, but that's not non-controversial. And generally speaking, and this, again, like, this was the point brought up by, what's-her-face, Morgan. And I had some issues with Morgan as well. I had a lot of issues with Morgan, actually. The land back person who talked to Vaush. But this is not a ubiquitous feature of anti-colonial actors generally. This is very specific. And crucially, Professor Flowers wasn't advocating for those things, but she was giving a defense of them, which raises eyebrows because practically it's very difficult to imagine doing something like that without going into effectively genocidal territory.
So this is Sunday's recapping his interpretation of what happened in the Professor Flowers-Vaush debate. The crucial question then would be, is this characterization at all correct? Is that what Professor Flowers argued for? And the answer is no. This is a misrepresentation of Flowers' argument that just happens to line up with Vaush's misrepresentation, one that he repeated multiple times throughout this entire scandal, if that's what you want to call it. Professor Flowers' argument, one that she has clarified many times in different ways, is best summed up in this clip from her debate with Vaush.
My point is that the people who colonize those people, if the people who are there and they live in their own country don't want to live with people who are colonized, they should have the right to determine if they want to live with those people or not. And I think that could look like a number of things. And my point is that it doesn't actually have to always look like genocide. And the way that you're painting it is just comparing it to white nationalism. And so my point is that you can critique these things. You don't have to agree with these things, but you can talk about that sentiment without calling it the same thing as white nationalism. And that's my point of the two videos.
She also qualified this argument with the claim that decolonization is not always a peaceful thing, and that it is indeed a complex and sometimes violent process that is hard to be exact about.
The reason why I'm being vague is because if you look at different countries who have decolonized themselves, you have like all these different ways that those countries have gone about it. You have people who have been very violent, and you have people who have somehow done it peacefully. We're reading a book called Ujamaa, or it's called Ujamaa, but it's by Julius Nyerere, who was one of the leaders of getting rid of colonialism in Tanzania. Unfortunately, after he died, a lot of things were put in place, but he did it completely through voting, which is amazing. And we're also reading like Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. Frantz Fanon did a lot of work in Algeria, which and there was like a lot of violence that happened there. I think like dealing with colonialism is going to be messy, and there needs to be room to have nuance in these conversations. And I think just kind of reducing it to like, oh, this is white nationalism is very reductive, and it doesn't really give space for those people to talk about what to do.
I just don't understand.
So, for Sunday to be right, we would have to find parts of the debate where Flowers deviates from these 2 points, and where she begins defending, but not advocating for, a state's right to commit an action that would be genocide. But that doesn't happen. Ever. Here is a list of timestamps from the entire debate where Flowers keeps touching upon the same 2 basic points over and over again. She contextualizes them with various examples, but she at no point begins to argue for a state's right to commit any action, and she does not defend anything that would be genocide. In fact, Vaush keeps accusing Professor Flowers of doing this exact thing multiple times, but Flowers' wording is specific in this regard. Her argument never shifts to approximate Vaush's straw man. She just keeps responding with different versions of the same 2 takes. For somebody who insists they watched the debate multiple times, Sunday should really actually watch it all the way till the end, because there's no way that you could come away with this characterization of her argument if you actually did that, unless you were trying to lie, which I don't know. Later, we get to South Africa, and Vaush draws a deeply clumsy link between the 6 million killed in the Holocaust and the hypothetical mass deportation of the 6 million whites who currently live in South Africa. The Holocaust link is incidentally a rhetorical strategy shared by white supremacist and neo-Nazi elements both in South Africa and beyond that actively spread the lie that white South Africans are the victim of impending or currently ongoing genocide perpetrated by black South Africans. So, that's pretty unfortunate, to put it mildly. Let us examine this dumbass hypothetical in detail.
Now I'll ask you again, when it comes to
Okay.
South Africa, what do you think of the 6 million white people who live in that country? Do you think the black people, who are by far the majority, have a right to remove the white population?
And Professor Flowers replies,
I personally don't think that would be a good idea, but I do think that
Do they have a right
it's
to?
up to yeah, I think so. I think they have the right to discuss what to do about that. And if that
see.
means that they have to remove the people, then I think that they would have a right to do that. But I think that would be really harsh. And I think that they're not even going to do that.
as we will see in a bit, this hypothetical example has virtually no relation to what is happening in the real world, especially since South Africa's anti-colonial leaders explicitly rejected the notion that all the white people in South Africa should be deported and their assets seized. Hence why they advocated for the concept of a rainbow nation. A rainbow nation meaning a country where all these various racial groups that live in South Africa, such as whites, Indians, and black South Africans, could all live in harmony. Apart from just how gross it is to make a comparison between something that would not be genocide, more on that later, and what is literally the worst atrocity ever committed in modern history, and perhaps all time, Vaush's hypothetical is just completely uneducated. South Africa's white population is just under 4.6 million as of the most recent census performed in 2011, meaning Vaush had to contort the facts to concoct this racist gotcha hypothetical. Also, as Professor Flowers has pointed out, South Africa, as with virtually all African nations, is multi-ethnic in that its black populations belong to a diverse range of ethnic identities, and as such, a 100% black South African state would not be an ethno-state, by definition. And again, I must stress this is not even on the table. In the real world, South African politicians have begun some tepid moves towards land redistribution so as to return land to its original owners, but this has been a slow legal process and has been criticized by some, read many, for being way too slow. Putting that aside, we need to litigate 2 questions about Flowers' response to this hypothetical to determine if she ever argues for the things Sunday claims she argued for. A. Does her response constitute a major deviation from her original point? And B. Is it a defense of an act committed by the state that could only result in genocide? This is fundamentally the same argument that Flowers stipulated at the debate's onset, and that she repeats throughout the debate. As she stated at 6:58,
My point is that the people who colonize those people, if the people who are there and they live in their own country don't want to live with people who are colonized, they should have the right to determine if they want to live with those people or not.
and as Professor Flowers pointed out, she would not agree to take the extreme measures, i.e. mass deportation of all white South Africans, Vaush implies in this hypothetical. But she would still think that the black people of South Africa should have the right to determine whether they should continue living next to their colonizers.
I personally don't think that would be a good idea, but I do think that
Do they have a right to?
it's up to yeah, I think so. I think they have the right to discuss what to do about that. And if that
see.
means that they have to remove the people, then I think that they would have a right to do that. But I think that would be really harsh. And I think that they're not even going to do that.
Remember, Vaush says black people. There's no mention of states here, and no mention of using state power to effectuate this will. Even if there had been, which I must emphasize there wasn't, since President Sunday keeps insisting the opposite, even if there had been, Flowers' response is not ambiguous in that she is talking about the right of the black people of South Africa to choose whether or not they want to live apart from their oppressors. A process which, as she stated from the outset, can take many forms.
The reason why I'm being vague is because if you look at different countries who have decolonized themselves, you have like all these different ways that those countries have gone about it. You have people who have been very violent, and you have people who have somehow done it peacefully.
Again, Professor Flowers doesn't argue for a state's right to do anything. Her argument, which she repeats multiple times, explicitly refers to the people's right, meaning colonized people, to decide whether they want to continue living next to their colonizers. I know this is getting repetitive, but Professor Flowers never argues explicitly within the frame of reference of states. Even by the standards of Vaush's hypothetical, it must be stressed that the act he describes would not be considered genocide in any case. In fact, as we shall soon see, none of the events in which dismantling of a colonial presence led to the settlers moving out resulted in genocide, regardless of whether state power was used to force settlers to move or not. Obviously, that doesn't mean that you or I may not have severe misgivings with the idea that all the white people in South Africa should be enjoined to leave. For the record, I do have problems with that, as does Professor Flowers. However, forcing all the white people out of South Africa would not be genocide according to international law, according to the UN definition of genocide that President Sunday keeps bringing up. Even if that effort to force out the colonizers is accompanied by various forms of state violence, meaning, seizing assets and therefore coercing them through various legal and economic means to move out, that still isn't genocide under the UN definition of genocide. International law actually goes out of its way to stipulate this. Here is the Genocide Convention, i.e., the UN definition of genocide. Feel free to pause it and read it in its entirety. For the purposes of this video, I want you to pay special attention to the last bit, and I quote, "Cultural destruction does not suffice, nor does an intention to simply disperse a group. Ergo, forcing them to move out is not genocide." Vaush never mentioned mass extermination or anything like that when he originally articulated his hypothetical. He insists that that is where his example would lead without any basis, but that happens much later when he asserts that mass deportation and cultural destruction would be genocide, but this is directly contradicting what international law stipulates. And since this is a fake genocide that he made up, Vaush can make this example up to be anything he wants it to be. He could add any caveats to the hypothetical after the fact and make it seem like Flowers signed off on those imaginary outcomes, but that doesn't mean shit, since it's not the scenario that Flowers was asked to respond to, and either way, she at no point defended a state's right to do anything, nor did she defend any action that would be considered genocide or would inevitably lead to genocide. The only way to argue that this point is wrong is to actively misrepresent what was said by both Vaush and Professor Flowers.
Nor does her argument apply to scenarios where genocide is the only outcome. It actually really does. It really does. I'm sorry.
It really doesn't. I am not sorry. You are either lying or you've made a mistake here. Let us talk a bit more about decolonization in the real world. As you may have picked up, I have a real issue with Vaush's hypothetical, and that is for the simple reason that it is an uneducated fantasy that was concocted to win a debate. It has little to no basis in how decolonization works in the real world, and that's important because we need to keep arguments on decolonization grounded in reality, lest we come to absurdly unjust conclusions. With that in mind, it must be said that international law does not consider any real-life instances of decolonization in which white settlers left after the end of the colonial period, such as in, say, Kenya, Indonesia, Vietnam, Algeria, South Africa, Angola, and Libya, just to name a few, to be genocide. In other words, not a single one of these events invariably/inevitably led to genocide, and most of them consist of variations on the theme of what Flowers was defending. In fact, she even mentioned the Kenyan example in the debate. In all of the referenced cases, the collapse of the colonial system resulted in a significant reduction in the white settler population. In some cases, it led to the near complete exodus of the settlers. None of these incidents of mass white flight are considered to be genocides, and in virtually all cases, the bulk of the settler population left in the immediate aftermath of their colonial state's collapse. Not surprising, since the system that was supporting their presence was now gone. There is also something to be said for racism as a motivator for white flight. After all, European settlers in these countries lived in a white supremacist colonial society divided along racial lines, and as such, the prospect of living under the rule of people previously cast as racially inferior would be something pretty scary if you were a real racist. I am not saying that this was the only reason a settler would leave, but it was certainly a significant factor, especially in places such as Algeria. We must also be very careful not to conflate the hypothetical non-existent genocides against white people concocted by the debate bros and passed off as legitimate examples of decolonization, and the violence that often is part and parcel of decolonization struggles. This is for many reasons. Firstly, violence has often been a tool that colonized people have resorted to as part of the decolonization struggle, and while this is something that might seem quite radical and perhaps wrong to an outward observer, it must be recognized that colonialism is constant violence against the colonial subject. It is the unceasing attempt to dehumanize the colonial subject and reduce them to mere human material for the benefit of the imperialist capitalist systems of an intercontinental empire. Colonial powers use all manner of violence to effectuate this result. This is unsurprisingly deeply harmful to the colonial subjects psychologically and often physically, as they are basically living under a system that constantly tells them that they are less than human and brutally punishes them if they so much as say something transgressive or try to exercise any form of agency. In these kinds of dire situations, violence can become the tool by which a colonized person reclaims that agency and, by extension, their humanity. Remember that oppressive systems such as colonialism can and do use violence to defend and sustain themselves. You can feel free to disagree with the idea that violence is the best way to achieve anti-colonial aims, but it is absolutely crucial in a post-colonial context that you accept the reality that the act of colonialism and the act of violently resisting colonialism are two very different things, and likewise that a fake genocide shouldn't be conflated with anti-colonial violence as a concept. This false equivocation is intellectually dishonest because you necessarily have to ignore the historical context of colonialism in order to make this comparison. In one case, a large, wealthy, well-armed empire attacked a country with little to no provocation, eliminated its sovereignty, and reduced its people to second-class citizens in a racial caste system, often using genocide as a tool to effectuate that result. And in the other case, those colonized people tried to disrupt and destroy that deeply harmful and exploitative system. Any equivocation here gives the advantage to those who would defend colonialism because it allows the horrific atrocities that gave us that hierarchy and that continuously reinforce it to escape scrutiny. By the same token, we are also made to focus on the violence committed by an anti-colonial revolutionary in complete isolation of any societal or systemic factors that drive them to violently resist the colonial order. In other words, this equivocation eliminates most nuance from a discussion on anti-colonial violence, allowing for a simplistic one-dimensional view that banalizes the existence of colonialism by obscuring the constant violence necessary to sustain it, and stigmatizes any individual or group that attempts to deconstruct said colonial system. The reason I am expounding upon this point will become clear later, but for now just keep it in mind. I know this sounds like a huge digression, but trust me, it is directly related to Sunday's response.
my argument has always been, like, you have to bite the bullet and recognize that what you're doing effectively is asserting the hegemony of one actor historically over another for the sake of avoiding what your society has already done. That doesn't necessarily mean that's the wrong decision, but that is what you're doing, and you need to be able to recognize that in order to actually appropriately, well, to make the future as to not compound the injustices going forward, I suppose is how I would phrase that.
So this is the argument that Sunday insists at 1740 that he has already made, and which my original video incorrectly suggested that he didn't make. It is also an argument that crops up repeatedly in his other interactions and discussions regarding the Professor Flowers controversy. I put this here to set the record straight right off the bat, but also to establish a general idea that we will be coming to repeatedly. Namely, once we look at the actual substance of Sunday's arguments, we can see some deeper issues with his reasoning that my original video missed. Sunday's argument is very similar to the critique that I fielded in my original video, but contrary to his insistences, there is a notable difference. Let's start off by noting the odd ambiguity that crops up in the way that President Sunday words this argument here and in other videos. He says that imposing a necessary colonial context, i.e. forcibly prolonging colonial domination of a racialized community for the sake of averting fictional genocides that exist only in the minds of debate bros, is something that is not necessarily the wrong decision, so long as we acknowledge that that is indeed what we are doing. That's weird, isn't it? For one, President Sunday goes on to declare that he is not comfortable with the idea, which would imply that he isn't for this idea, and yet here his stance on its merit and moral implications is kinda wishy-washy. This is also weird because President Sunday has repeatedly said that his aim is to represent the people that Professor Flowers, quote, failed to represent. So he's defending these colonized communities, but at the same time he's arguing that there is a scenario where we could leave in place some of the elements of colonialism and that would be a potentially beneficial thing to do for the sake of heading off an entirely imaginary risk. Hopefully you are already seeing the glaring contradiction in that position. An advocate for colonized people would not, under any circumstances, argue that the partial preservation of the institution of colonialism would be a not necessarily wrong thing to do. And while I do not want to speak for colonized people, I am pretty confident in declaring that most colonized people would probably not support an idea that leaves some component of the system that oppresses them in place. You know? This is the kind of argument that only makes sense if you are considering this question within the bounds of some in vacuo philosophical realm, where the real world and its often very stark material circumstances and injustices don't apply. That's the problem I have with your entire shtick, President Sunday, because what you're doing here is making this show of speaking for colonized people, but the people have clearly been taken out of the equation. And because you have decided not to factor this consideration into your argument, you're left in this weird limbo where you're stuck arguing that Vaush's idea makes you uncomfortable, while implying that it would be okay to bring that idea to fruition so long as we are honest that this is what we are in fact doing, and so long as we can somehow ensure that this would definitely prevent the imaginary genocides Vaush made up. You're effectively left saying that there is a good reason for us to continue to rule over colonized people, if it means we could avert compounding injustices going forward, but any outcome in which we still have colonialism in place, even a really neutered form of it, is going to necessarily be an outcome that compounds injustices. I will note that my argument at no point endeavors to engage in any such moral gymnastics. It merely implies that prolonging colonialism for the sake of averting a genocide that Vaush concocted to dunk on someone in a debate is a bad idea, given that colonialism is bad and fake genocides aren't real.
It's my response to President Sunday's response titled Yeah, this is addressed to me. Why are we going on about the colonizer thing? I never argued on this point. In context, I take your point that like there are subcultures where this kind of equivocation is done with no malign intent, and it's just sort of normalized, and there's a historical basis for it, and it's not the same as when white nationalists deploy slurs against non-white groups in North America, say. However, given the fact that she had just come off of a discussion pertaining specifically to the self-determination of states along basically
I think
ethnic
this was
grounds, the danger here, which I agree with pointing out, I think this was sloppy on Professor Flowers' part. I don't think she was indicating something about her actual intent in the initial debate that way, but like, I mean, who can know ultimately?
If only there was somewhere we could go to learn what Professor Flowers actually thinks about this issue.
But the issue here primarily is that you're talking about, okay, we're talking about national self-determination as being the ability to do everything. That's what self-determination means. In this territory that you control, something else other than a colonially imposed sovereign determines what is and what is not. And this includes who occupies what territory, or if any at all. You come from that argument. You're already characterized as being a genocide apologist. And now you give indications that you make no sharp distinction between being white and being a colonizer, which bears the connotation of being culpable for colonial violence. Bad move. This is an optics nightmare. I don't think she's showing her hand as being a genocide apologist here, but on the basis of this alone, I can't tell someone she's not. And that's the problem with this.
The core issue with Sunday's line of reasoning in this segment is that he is taking some assumptions totally for granted. Since he argues that Flowers was explicitly defending a state's right to commit an action that would be genocidal, but that she doesn't consider genocidal, which of course is not at all what she argued, he therefore views her using the word colonizer as a bad move, since it plays into the idea that she is secretly or unwittingly pro-genocide. From this, it is pretty clear that Sunday's arguments lend themselves pretty heavily to Vaush's misrepresentations of what Flowers has said and what she argued for. After all, Vaush has repeatedly argued in multiple instances, including in his debate with Professor Flowers, that the fact that she uses colonizer and white interchangeably is evidence of her racial bias. Also, this argument ignores a pretty obvious reason that Flowers would use the word colonizer, namely that she belongs to a subculture known as activists that have a specific intent in using that word. In simple terms, calling others or oneself a colonizer in the parlance of an activist means recognizing the role that we as individuals play in a wider system of white settler colonialism. It is a basic recognition that we, meaning white people, benefit from a system that has been constructed to benefit us specifically at the expense of a wide spectrum of other people, such as African Americans and the indigenous, who are treated as subhuman. That's it. Being called a colonizer doesn't mean you are literally a genocidal white settler who wipes out indigenous villages or something. It isn't some weird conspiracy to normalize violence against white people. It's the bare minimum recognition that we live in an unequal system where reconciliation, reparation, and recognition of past and current injustices are sorely needed. By this definition, we, meaning us white people living in the United States and Canada, are colonizers because by virtue of living on stolen land, we perpetuate and reinforce a settler colonial system. Notice that this doesn't mean we necessarily agree with that system or that we are directly culpable for violence against the indigenous, but we are nonetheless involved in the process of settler colonialism, whether we like it or not. It's frankly quite odd to me that Sunday, a guy from Canada, would have such trouble with this concept, given that the idea of territorial acknowledgement is widely practiced throughout that country, especially in academic spaces such as the University of Victoria, a place Sunday mentioned in his response. For those not in the know, a territorial acknowledgement is the act of taking a moment to recognize your presence as a settler on stolen land. It involves saying the names of the nations that once lived on the land, and sometimes using the name by which said nations referred to the land. This can take various forms and can be as simple as the master of ceremonies at a get-together or a lecturer in a class saying, "Before we begin, I want us to take a moment to recognize that we are on the traditional territory of nation names." As with the use of the word colonizer, a territorial acknowledgement is just a basic recognition that you are living on land that was brutally stolen. It is an act of normalizing that reality and disrupting narratives that seek to banalize or obfuscate the truth by painting indigenous peoples as a figment of the past. In other words, territorial acknowledgments and the activist use of the word colonizer are means by which we can challenge narratives of settler futurity, i.e., narratives that seek to paint indigenous people as solely figments of history that gave way to settler colonialism. Saying the word colonizer in the activist sense therefore represents a basic but necessary first step on the path to justice. There's no hidden threat in this act, no attempt to villainize white people or essentialize anyone. Throughout this quote, Sunday wants to have it both ways. He understands that there are subcultures where the word colonizer isn't said with malign intent, but muses about the quote-unquote actual intent of Professor Flowers, who is an activist. He knows that the word colonizer isn't the same as a racial slur, but he still treats it as a word that has the same dangerous implications a racial slur would have. Plus, he is holding Professor Flowers to task for the false narratives that characterized her as pro-genocide and seemingly ignoring that those are lies and that she shouldn't have to police her tone to appease racist imbeciles who don't understand what racial essentialism is and who are predisposed to view Professor Flowers as evil because a guy with 400,000 subscribers told them she was. And while Sunday never explicitly argues that we need to stop subcultures from using the word colonizer, that is the unstated implication of his argument here. If a word is so volatile that using it raises concerns of you being pro-genocide, that means we have a strong reason to stop people from saying it, either through social pressure or other less pleasant means. And when you recall that we are having this discussion in a settler colonial society where there is now a resurgence in indigenous activism, it doesn't take much to see the ways in which this kind of argument is potentially harmful, especially in a settler colonial state that directly harms indigenous communities in a myriad of ways.
You got to read The Wretched of the Earth again, buddy. That would not that, that would not sell the idea that Professor Flowers is against genocidal violence.
Remember when I was talking about conflating hypothetical genocidal violence with anti-colonial violence in general, like as a concept? Well, this is where that connection comes in. This quip would imply that President Sunday thinks that Fanon's book, Wretched of the Earth, was advocating for genocidal violence, presumably against colonizers. Of course, he is characteristically coy about his exact meaning here, but it's hard to infer any other conclusion from what he says. So, does Fanon's book advocate for genocidal violence? Was it stupid of me to bring it up in an argument that was defending Professor Flowers? No. Of course not. Frantz Fanon was a very influential figure in post-colonial studies, and was in fact an anti-colonial activist. He was a true radical, a Marxist with Pan-Africanist aspirations who believed colonialism should be resisted by any means necessary. Fanon was born in 1925 on the French-controlled Caribbean island of Martinique, and later moved to metropolitan France to study medicine. Wretched of the Earth is hugely influenced by his experiences in the Algerian War of Independence, during which he volunteered as a doctor and psychiatrist for the National Front of Liberation. Fanon's book is widely considered to be a landmark piece of literature in post-colonial studies. It is in fact so influential that it's a prerequisite that you read this book if you're going to get into this subject matter. The book focuses heavily on the psychopathology of colonialism, ergo what colonialism does to the colonial subject on a psychological level. It provides a devastating picture of the trauma and servility that colonialism induces in the colonial subject by indoctrinating them into a system in which they are treated essentially as an inferior species. The book also harshly critiques native intellectual elites and what Fanon saw as their aggressive attempt to assimilate to the status quo of the colonizer. The book also provides prophetic warnings of neo-colonialist problems that curtail revolutionary momentum in a post-colonial country, thereby averting full liberation. In Fanon's view, decolonization could only be a violent process because it involved the destruction of an exploitative racial order that uses violence to perpetuate and reinforce itself. Pacifism for Fanon would only result in a partial decolonization at best. Therefore, it would only derail colonized people on their quest for full self-determination in the long run. This is detailed in one of the most notable sections of the book, On Violence, or Concerning Violence, where Fanon characterizes violence as a means for the colonized subjects to reclaim their humanity and reject notions that they are inferior to the settler class. Fanon never advocated for genocide or for genocidal violence. In fact, he characterized the mass abduction and torture of Algerian civilians by French authorities over the course of the War of Independence as genocide. He clearly was not a fan of genocidal violence. To imply that he was is to betray a basic misunderstanding of Fanon's writings. What Fanon did do is advocate for the utility of violence as a tool for destroying the colonial status quo. This right here is effectively Sunday conflating Vaush's racist fantasy of white genocide with all anti-colonial violence in general. It's really ironic because my exact accusation against Sunday is that he did not understand post-colonial studies well enough to defend it. And here he is demonstrating a fundamental misunderstanding of one of the foundational texts of post-colonial studies. Sunday read a book from an anti-colonial activist advocating for the utility of revolutionary violence against colonial oppressors, and he interpreted that as a call for genocidal violence against colonizers. This is especially droll when we recall that Professor Flowers literally admitted to reading this book in her debate with Vaush. And of course she did. Of course she read it, and of course she thought it was pertinent to her argument. As I've said, Flowers is well aware that decolonization can be a violent process, and that therefore we have to consider it with nuance, and Fanon's book doesn't denigrate her argument in any way. Look, if you don't like violence, as a rule, if you think that no matter what happens, no matter what circumstances we're talking about, violence is always bad, well then you should just say that, right? There's nothing stopping you from making that argument and making it sound halfway reasonable. But instead you made this bizarre quip that suggests you missed the point completely with Fanon. So I guess you have to read the book again, I don't know, because there's no way that you read the book and came to that understanding. Honestly, it's pretty hard for me to believe that you, President Sunday, have such a poor understanding of Wretched of the Earth that you literally think Fanon advocated for genocidal violence in it. Because if that is what you really think, well, let's just say that you're showing off something, some sort of level. I wonder what they call that. I always forget. It's right on the tip of my tongue. Showing your energy level.
No. She didn't leave a typo in. She added in punctuation that made stuff Vaush said look like it was a part of a sentence I was saying, and then used that to characterize my part of that conversation as me elaborating on on Professor Flowers lacking intelligence, which I didn't do. I said she was an idiot, but that's it. I wasn't making a remark on her intelligence. I actually think she's fairly smart, in like a very specific sense, to be clear, not in the context of that discourse. But I did not like the language was very distinct between us. I said, you hit the nail on the head a second ago, Vaush. Professor Flowers is an idiot, and she didn't understand that this point, that the argument she was making, if carried into practice, would lead to this. And then Vaush replied, that's what I was saying. She doesn't have the intelligence to recognize the consequences of her priors, or something like that. That's a aesthetically very distinct sentence from what I said. And she collapsed the two, because in the transcript there's no punctuation. But she added punctuation that makes them appear to be the same. That's the problem.
Oh, wait, what? So she is an idiot, but in a very specific way. She's actually like really super confident in other ways, but then in this specific way, she's an idiot. Yeah, that makes sense. Also, I love the concept that you can call someone dumb or an idiot and somehow not have that be a commentary on their intelligence. That's a whole new level of being too scared to say what you actually mean. I also am not at all sure what Sunday means when he says that Vaush's statement is aesthetically different from his elaborating on Professor Flowers' intelligence. They're basically expressing the exact same sentiment, but with different wording. So yeah, that part doesn't really make much sense. You called her an idiot who doesn't understand where her ideas lead, and Vaush said she's not intelligent enough to understand where her ideas lead. Like, where's the difference there, exactly? But okay, let's move past that and let's engage with Sunday's allegations in more detail. I think there's a basic semantic disagreement here that is at the foundation of why Sunday misrepresents this as Professor Flowers lying about him elaborating on her intelligence. To most people, when I say that I elaborated on something, it means that I made a claim and then I said a few more sentences after that. I think that's how most people understand the concept of elaborating on something. So if I just said, Sunday is a milk drinker, and left it at that, then I didn't elaborate on that, right? I just made the claim and that's it. But if I say, President Sunday is a milk drinker, and then I continue on in that same vein for a few more sentences, that is referred to as elaborating on an idea. Your argument is that because Professor Flowers added an extra sentence to those extra sentences that you actually said, and also she used deceptive punctuation, she was doing a lie. But here's the rub, as you would say. If we remove that extra sentence, you are still elaborating on Professor Flowers' intelligence. You still are elaborating on the idea that she is an idiot, even if your elaboration doesn't include the extra sentence you assert Professor Flowers added and deceptively punctuated to make you look bad. This isn't deception, it's literally how language works, my guy. Even when we correct Professor Flowers' error, you are still elaborating on her intelligence. It does not change that fact. It just means that you elaborated on it a little less, and that's kind of a weird technicality to base your entire argument on, you know? Also, the punctuation point is pretty moot. By Professor Flowers' own admission, she did not notice at first that the extra sentence she added was not something you said. Obviously, she put punctuation in the transcript because she wants to make it easier for people to read the transcript. So yeah, she put punctuation, and this error made it to the final video uploaded to YouTube and was corrected the same day. It's definitely sloppy, but again, Professor Flowers noticed the error, and within hours she had re-uploaded the entire video with the error removed and a disclaimer appended that explained what the error was. Most people have never seen the uncorrected video because it wasn't up that long. So I doubt that this error affected people's opinions more than your actual words and actions. So basically, you're left arguing that she put this one sentence in, and that was her master plan to make you look bad, as if this section, where you do elaborate on her intelligence doesn't make you look bad all on its own. That's the point here, Sunday. This looks bad all on its own because this does show you elaborating on Flowers' intelligence. If you disagree with that, your problem isn't with Flowers, but with the English language, because this is what elaborating on something means. Noticed it and re-uploaded the entire video
with with the continued part where she says, I elaborate. I then go on to elaborate on it. I don't just call her an idiot, I elaborate. And she used this to try and characterize me as a racist. I'm a white person making commentary on the IQ of a black person, which is a really sinister thing to do.
Yes, and it's not dishonest for her to correct the mistake, but still leave in the segment where she talks about you elaborating on her intelligence, because again, even with that mistake corrected, her claim is still correct. This is getting repetitive, but the accusation is still valid, even with the extra sentence removed. Also, another thing to say here is that while I do think that elaborating on Professor Flowers' intelligence, as Sunday did, is a really gross thing to do to a person, especially given the context, it's not like the end of your channel or something. If you were to admit the truth, which is that you did this and you know that you did it, and that it's bad and that you shouldn't do it, that doesn't mean you'll get banished to Bad People Island or something. It doesn't mean your viewers would stop watching either. You can just admit your mistake and grow from it. What makes this worse is that you're not being honest, and it's really obvious that you're not being honest. You're denying something which is self-evident. If you don't consider those extra few sentences to be an elaboration on Professor Flowers' intelligence, you're just willfully ignoring what's staring you right in the face, and that's pretty unfortunate, to say the least. He instead affirmed it and elaborated on it. And yeah, you did elaborate on it, President Sunday.
No, I didn't. That was the thing that Professor Flowers lied about. That was the problem. You're not the most attentive person in the world, are you, Ninth Wave?
Yeah, because she didn't like the word bloodline, and then
No,
she said
it's because Vaush, you hit it on the head a second ago. She's an idiot. She thinks you can do this without that. She is wrong. That doesn't mean she endorses the thing that would happen. She's mistaken about what's in their power to do.
That's my point. My point is that she's not intelligent enough to realize that her priors lead to genocide.
No, it was her fault for coming off as an extraordinarily arrogant and pugnacious person. Not for arguing a point she wasn't equipped to defend for no reason, like other people are equipped to defend it. And then getting involved with a bunch of people who are basically just engaged in a perpetual slander campaign against the people you were supposedly trying to convince. Like, she came into that initial conversation with this weird brownie point thing where I guess she was like keeping score from some, I guess, racial faux pas that Vaush committed during the course of that conversation. I even commented on this because I wasn't on Professor Flowers' side with my initial coverage of the debate. I had to think about this after the fact. Like, that looked bad. That looked really bad. A lot of this looked really bad. Not to blow smoke up Vaush's ass, but I'd like to see this person debate Vaush on the subject if they think you did so poorly. I don't think I did poorly. I think I did fail, but I don't think I set a goal for myself that I could succeed at. I think I did better than I expected. That being said, yeah, like this wasn't a video essay. You don't have, especially when you're not the host, you don't have time on your side. At any given time, Vaush just could have cut the call and just characterized me as bad faith, and that would have been that. And she said afterwards, like, she didn't, this was her cope after that conversation went completely sideways. I didn't care about convincing Vaush. I didn't care about defending the position, because I don't have to. I just wanted to dunk on Vaush. It's like, great, congratulations. You're just so fucking pointless.
Oh dear, it seems I have frustrated the president. So, let me get this straight. You watched 7 months of a coordinated harassment campaign play out against a small YouTuber. You watched the avalanche of racist bile that she's had to deal with for all these months, being compared to Hitler, being labeled pro-genocide, having all this speculation about her wanting to kill her own family, and being dehumanized and mocked over and over again on various streams. You watched her career stall because she was reduced to such a depressive state that she could not write nor create anything for months. You later saw this person state, in no uncertain terms, that this racist abuse drove them to contemplate suicide. And your conclusion from this entire thing, is that Professor Flowers was at fault. In the past, you've even gone out of your way to absolve Vaush of any culpability in the mass harassment campaign that he directly orchestrated through his rhetoric that you are now echoing in this response video.
Do I regard that as harassment? Not inherently, but it's probably just as bad in a lot of ways. I don't think it leaves Vaush morally culpable insofar as, again, I don't think he's responsible for how other people react to him having an organic discussion in which somebody comes out looking bad. I think in this particular case, she came out looking bad for dishonorable reasons, which is my principal objection.
President Sunday then goes on to elaborate that since Vaush isn't a cop or a prime minister, that we can't possibly expect him to have a sense of decency and not use his platform to engage in mass harassment. Yeah, that makes sense. How can we expect someone in the powerless position of having hundreds of thousands of followers that believe everything he says to not enable mass harassment? And not actively stoke the flames of bigotry and white supremacy. Come on, guys, be more reasonable. Stop asking so much of this person. Meanwhile, Professor Flowers, the person who was targeted by a bunch of triggered racist snowflakes who called her a Nazi and all of this other horrible stuff, is the childish person in this situation because she made a mild joke about brownie points. She got angry when people patronized her and treated her like garbage and tried to stand up for herself. What pugnacity! The gall of some people! Vaush repeatedly characterized her as uneducated, dumb, racist, and akin to a white supremacist, and he even did this in his debate with Sunday multiple times. But Professor Flowers is the arrogant and pugnacious one here? Huh. It almost sounds like you think Professor Flowers deserved what happened to her, that it was an inevitable consequence of her not acting the right way you would have preferred her to act. And I just have to ask, why is it so hard for you to feel empathy for this person? Let's say, for the sake of argument, that everything you say about Professor Flowers is correct. Let's say that she is, in fact, this person who's an idiot, who makes these arguments and doesn't really understand what their implications are. Let's go further and say that she is this combative and arrogant person that lies all the time to defend her own ego. Let's endorse all these points as if they are reasonable things to say and not obvious white supremacist bullshit that should have no place in this discussion. Would that mean that Professor Flowers deserves the treatment she received? Would that mean that we are now okay to dehumanize her in this way and literally drive her to suicidal ideation? And once that horrific harassment campaign blows over, are you really okay with insisting after that fact that it's her fault that she was treated that way because she didn't embody your ideas of bourgeois respectability that you arbitrarily decided makes someone's opinion worth listening to? I guess you are, because that's what you're saying here. Your little tirade here demonstrated my point better than I ever could. Put simply, you lack the capacity to view this subject in a nuanced way, and you clearly have some biases that stop you from showing basic empathy. And that's pretty fucking tragic. You'd rather blame the victim and put her every action under intense scrutiny rather than call out the racial animus that is staring you right in the face. Like, Sunday, I think what you've said in this quote is pretty invidious. I think you've also associated with people that have said some bad stuff and done harmful shit that you defended. I think that that's pretty cowardly of you, but I don't think you should be driven off of YouTube or made to feel suicidal because of a wrong thing you did, If something like what Professor Flowers went through happened to you, or anyone else on YouTube for that matter, I wouldn't say it was your fault or their fault just because you were pugnacious or made a brownie points joke. No amount of wrongdoing, real or imagined, makes you deserving of that kind of shit. And I don't understand why you can't show an ounce of humanity here. It would cost you nothing. It would cost you a small sliver of your pride, admittedly. It would mean fessing up to the fact that you were wrong in this one instance, but I guess that's too high a price to pay for some. Ah well. Hey there! Ninth Wave here, coming to you from an unspecified location with a pre-recorded message. I pre-recorded this because I don't have a microphone that can fit in this helmet, and also it's really windy, so probably the audio would get ruined. It's also really hot out here. I want you to appreciate that, alright? I wanted to cap this video off by making a few disclaimers. First of all, I've said a lot of strongly worded things in this video about President Sunday. However, I want to make it clear, though, that I don't actually think that President Sunday is bad or evil or a white supremacist. I just think that he really has some huge blind spots here, and it's something that he needs to confront in order to do better. I fully expect that this video is going to get torn apart and made fun of by President Sunday and his fans. And I don't care. I knew that going in, so no big deal. I wasn't trying to become popular with President Sunday's fans or something. My entire reason for making this video was to send a message about what I think YouTube culture should be, and specifically what it should be on lefty YouTube. Increasingly, we are having an issue with toxicity on lefty YouTube, where people are finding themselves increasingly unable to have difficult and nuanced discussions about certain topics without getting into the kind of scandals that Professor Flowers was sucked into. This is deeply concerning because lefty YouTube should be a space where we can have discussions like the one Professor Flowers and Vaush had without the debate degenerating into a fanfaronade of white supremacist adjacent bullshit. What happened here shouldn't happen on left YouTube, and the fact that it has happened and the fact that so many people are ready to defend it as normal and acceptable really worries me. This is increasingly becoming a space where a lot of people who clearly value being leftist or progressive in theory don't actually value it in practice, because they don't want to do the work that's required to adopt a more left-leaning position. They just want to engage in the pageantry of being the correct leftist, the person who is empirically, objectively right all the time by virtue of being a leftist. But they don't actually engage in any of the introspection or criticality necessary to be leftist in practice. In fact, a growing number of lefty dude bros seem vocally opposed to that idea. They balk at the idea that a white guy might not always be the authority on every issue, or that a former Nazi should not expect people of color to work with them just because they stopped being openly a Nazi. They seem to struggle with the idea that people can have lived experience, and that lived experience means that they might have a better perspective of a certain issue than they do. According to these guys, you're a segregationist or perhaps a Nazi if you think white people shouldn't have the right to invade spaces that aren't made for them. The entire Vaush-Professor Flowers debacle is a pretty good example of this divide because it literally centers around a refusal on Vaush's part to admit that he was wrong and that his error was motivated in part by ingrained biases. This whole dispute could have ended if Vaush had just admitted that he was wrong in his mischaracterizations of black nationalism and black separatism. All he had to do was concede that in this one instance, there were other people in the room that knew better than he did. But he couldn't admit that, not even for a moment. Instead, he doubled down and directly orchestrated a campaign of mass harassment that was deeply insidious and hateful. For the sake of his ego, discussion of post-colonial ideas has become a dangerous minefield, full of closeted racists who are just aching to call a black person a Nazi for daring to express their opinion on the issue. I know, however, that there are people out there who agree with me and what I'm saying right now, and that gives me some hope, because I know there are people out there who saw what happened here between Vaush and Professor Flowers and saw it for the deeply disgusting episode of white supremacy that it was. We can still do something to turn back the tide, but we need to reject the reactionary tendencies that are making their home in the online left, and that starts with speaking up. If we don't do that consistently and vocally, then we've already lost. Well, as you know, every good video ends with the hero riding off into the sunset. I don't have a horse, unfortunately, but I do have a crappy early 2000s Jeep, and as anyone who's ever ridden one knows, that's virtually the same thing, at least as far as the suspension is concerned. I plan to make much shorter videos on more fun topics than this in the future, so stay tuned for that. This video was way too long and it was a bitch to put together. So thanks for watching it all the way through. I really appreciate it. Alright, without further ado, I'll see you next time. Colonizer.